There is a version of your life you keep waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances, the right amount of stability before you finally do what you know you should, waiting for someone to give you permission, waiting for the situation to change on its own. And in the meantime, you tell yourself a story, a very reasonable, very convincing story, about why things are the way they are, about what was done to you, about what you didn't have, about what wasn't your fault. That story is not a lie exactly. The circumstances are real. The difficulties are real. The pain that shaped you is real. But Kant would tell you something that cuts through all of it. None of that eliminates what you are. And what you are is a being capable of reason. And a being capable of reason is a being capable of choice. And a being capable of choice has no one left to blame. That is not a motivational slogan. It is a philosophical conclusion, arrived at through rigorous logic, not optimism. Immanuel Kant, writing in the 18th century, didn't set out to make you feel empowered. He set out to understand the structure of morality itself. And what he found, at the foundation of that structure, was something most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. You are radically, absolutely, inescapably responsible for your moral choices, not partially, not conditionally, absolutely. Most philosophies give you somewhere to retreat. Determinism says your choices were inevitable. Consequentialism says what matters is the outcome, not the intention. Psychology says your patterns were formed before you had any say. Kant closes every exit. He doesn't deny that you were shaped by forces outside your control. He simply points out that you have the capacity to reason beyond those forces. And that capacity is precisely what makes you human, and precisely what makes you responsible. What Kant describes is not a burden imposed from outside. It is the structure of what you already are. You are not an animal running on instinct. You are not a machine executing programming. You are a rational agent, which means you have the ability to step back from your impulses, examine them, and choose whether to act on them. That ability is not a gift you can return. It is your nature, and it comes with a price. The price is this: you cannot legitimately claim you had no choice. Not when the boss gave the order, not when the culture said this was normal, not when your upbringing made it feel inevitable. As long as you can reason, you can question. As long as you can question, you can choose differently. And as long as you can choose differently, you own what you did. This is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be. Kant was not writing to comfort you. He was writing to tell you the truth about what you are, and what that means for how you live. What comes next is where that truth gets specific. Because the first thing Kant noticed about human beings is not that they are evil. It is that they are cowardly, and that cowardice has a name. Most people assume that ignorance is what keeps them from thinking for themselves. Kant knew better. The problem was never that people couldn't think. The problem was that they decided not to. He called this condition Unmündigkeit, usually translated as immaturity or minority. And his definition of it is precise enough to be uncomfortable. It is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. Not an inability rooted in lack of intelligence. An inability rooted in lack of courage. Kant was explicit about this. The person living in minority is not someone who cannot reason. It is someone who has chosen not to, because reasoning for yourself is harder, lonelier, and more dangerous than letting someone else do it for you. Look at how you actually live. Not how you think you live, how you actually live. When someone in authority tells you something is right, how often do you genuinely examine it? When the institution has a rule, how often do you ask whether that rule deserves to exist? When everyone around you agrees on something, how often do you sit with the discomfort of thinking they might all be wrong? Most people never do. Not because they lack the capacity, but because agreement is warm and independent thought is exposed. This is what Kant meant when he wrote that minority is self-imposed. No one forces you into it. You walk in voluntarily because the alternative is terrifying. To think for yourself means to accept that you might reach conclusions that isolate you, that your employer might be asking you to do something you cannot morally justify, that the tradition you inherited might be built on something you wouldn't choose if you were starting from scratch, that the crowd you belong to might be wrong, and you might have to say so out loud. The comfort of minority is the comfort of transferred responsibility. If you follow the order, the moral weight goes to whoever gave it. If you obey the rule is responsible, not you. If you do what everyone does, the diffusion of blame makes you feel nearly invisible. This is not weakness. It is a rational strategy for avoiding the unbearable pressure of being the one who decided. Kant saw this clearly, and he refused to let it stand as an excuse. Because here is what the strategy costs you. Every time you outsource your moral reasoning to an authority, a boss, a religion, a government, a social norm, you are not escaping responsibility. You are performing an act of abdication, and that abdication is itself a choice. You chose to follow. You chose not to question. You chose the warmth of consensus over the exposure of independent judgment. That choice belongs to you. The responsibility does not vanish because you handed the wheel to someone else. It stays. It accumulates. The escape feels total. It never is. And if abdication is itself a choice, a moral choice with moral consequences, then you cannot hide behind the structures you chose to obey, not the organization, not the tradition, not the cultural script. What you will find when you stop outsourcing and start examining is that most of what you've accepted without question cannot survive the examination. That is not an accident. That is exactly why you stopped examining. The question Kant forces you to face is not whether you had good reasons to follow. It is whether you could justify what you followed if you had to construct the justification yourself, from reason alone, without appeal to authority or tradition or the comfort of everyone else doing the same. You already know, in most cases, what that examination would produce, which is why the next move most people make is not toward examination. It is toward the most seductive story of all, the claim that they had no choice to begin with. "I had no choice" is the most democratic sentence in the human language. Everyone uses it. The executive who signed off on something he knew was wrong. The person who stayed in something corrosive because leaving felt impossible. The one who went along, said nothing, did what was expected, and later, quietly, felt the weight of it. Everyone has a version of this sentence ready. It costs nothing to say, and it buys everything. Kant takes it apart with the precision of a surgeon. The distinction he draws is between two kinds of imperatives. A hypothetical imperative tells you what to do if you want something. If you want to keep your job, comply. If you want to avoid conflict, stay silent. If you want to be liked, agree. These are the imperatives most people actually live by. Conditional rules that serve personal ends. They feel like logic. They are, in Kant's framework, simply sophisticated self-interest wearing the clothes of necessity. The categorical imperative operates differently. It doesn't negotiate with your desires or your circumstances. It commands unconditionally, not because of what you want, but because of what you are. And what you are is a rational being. That rationality is not a feature you can suspend when the situation gets difficult. It is always running, which means the capacity to step back, examine, and choose differently is always present. Which means "I had no choice" is never literally true. It is a description of what you were willing to pay, not what was actually available to you. This is where Kant becomes genuinely hard to sit with, because he does not deny that circumstances constrain you. Poverty is real. Coercion is real. The consequences of resistance can be catastrophic. He is not naive about the weight of the world pressing down on a person. What he refuses to grant is that weight eliminates choice. It changes the cost of the options. It does not remove the options themselves. Even under extreme coercion, even facing consequences you would do almost anything to avoid, you retain the capacity to reason about what you are doing. You can comply and know you are complying. You can obey and know you are obeying. That knowledge is not incidental. It is the signature of agency. It is proof that a choice was made, however agonizing, however understandable. Kant is not asking you to be a hero. He is asking you to be honest about what happened. The phrase, "I had no choice," usually means one of two things. Either the cost of the alternative was so high that you could not bring yourself to pay it, or you never seriously considered the alternative at all. Both are psychologically real. Neither is the same as having no choice. The first is a choice made under enormous pressure. The second is a choice made through avoidance. Kant sees both clearly, and he names them for what they are. Not to punish you, but because the diagnosis is the beginning of something. What gets built on the foundation of "I had no choice" is a self that is perpetually acted upon, perpetually at the mercy of forces it claims not to control. That self never has to examine anything, because nothing is ever really its decision. It is a self that cannot grow, cannot change, cannot take the kind of ownership that makes change possible. It is also, in Kant's terms, a self that has quietly stopped being a moral agent, not because it lost the capacity, but because it keeps refusing to use it. There is a specific brutality in recognizing this honestly. Not the brutality of judgment, but the brutality of precision. You chose the path of least resistance. That was a choice. You stayed silent when you knew better. That was a choice. You followed the order you couldn't morally justify. That was a choice. Naming these things does not make you a bad person. It makes you a responsible one, which is harder and more useful, and the only thing that actually opens the door forward. But knowing that you always had a choice is only the beginning. The harder question is what that choice should have been guided by. Kant's answer to that is one of the most demanding ideas in the history of philosophy, and it functions less like a rule than like a mirror, one that shows you exactly what you have been doing and exactly what it means. Most people treat morality like a negotiation. You weigh the situation, consider the consequences, factor in what you need, what others expect, what you can get away with, and somewhere in that calculation, you arrive at what you're going to do. You call it judgment. Sometimes you call it pragmatism. Kant called it something else, heteronomy. The will governed not by reason, but by whatever happens to be pulling at it from outside. He proposed something different, a single test, applied before any morally significant action. Not a calculation of outcomes, not a reading of the room. A question: could you will that the principle behind your action become a universal law, valid for everyone, in every similar situation, without exception? This is the first formulation of the categorical imperative, and it is deceptively simple. You are about to lie because the truth is inconvenient. Ask yourself, what if everyone lied whenever the truth was inconvenient? The institution of honest communication collapses. The very possibility of the lie being believed disappears. Your maxim, universalized, destroys itself. That is Kant's signal that the action is morally impermissible, not because of consequences in your particular case, but because the principle cannot survive universalization without contradiction. What makes this a mirror rather than a rule is what it forces you to see. The moment you apply it honestly, you realize how many of your justifications depend on a silent exemption you have granted yourself. You would not accept the behavior from others that you routinely practice yourself. You know this. The test simply makes you say it out loud in a form that cannot be rationalized away. The second formulation cuts deeper. Act so that you treat humanity, in your own person and in the person of anyone else, always as an end and never merely as a means. Not never as a means. Kant is precise here. People use each other as means constantly, and that is not inherently wrong. What is wrong is treating someone merely as a means, as an instrument for your purposes, with no regard for their own rational agency, their own ends, their own dignity. Run that through your life. The manipulation you dressed up as persuasion, the half-truth you told because the full truth would have complicated your position, the way you withheld information from someone so they would make the decision you wanted them to make. These are not dramatic violations. They are ordinary. That is what makes them worth examining. Because each one is a quiet decision that another person's rational agency matters less than your desired outcome. The third formulation is where Kant's philosophy becomes its most demanding. Act as if you were, through your maxims, a legislating member of a universal kingdom of ends, not a subject following laws handed down from above. A legislator, someone whose choices constitute the moral fabric of a world shared with other rational beings. You are not asking what you can get away with. You are asking what kind of world you are building, one decision at a time. Most people find this formulation easiest to dismiss because it sounds abstract. It is not abstract. It is the most personal version of the test. It asks, are you living as someone who takes seriously the weight of what it means to be a rational agent in a world full of other rational agents? Or are you living as someone who makes exceptions for yourself while expecting others to hold the line? The exemption is always the tell. It is the place where the reasoning stops, where the universalization quietly breaks down, where everyone suddenly becomes everyone except me in this particular case because Kant has no patience for it. Not because he is rigid, but because he understands what the exemption costs. It costs you the coherence of your own moral position. It costs the people you interact with the respect they are owed as rational beings. And it costs you something harder to name, the sense of being someone whose choices you can actually stand behind. These three formulations are not three different principles. They are three angles on the same truth. And that truth is not comfortable because it does not grade on a curve. It does not ask what you intended or how hard things were. It asks whether the principle behind what you did could hold up in a world where everyone operated by it. Most of what most people do cannot pass that test, not because they are bad people, because they have never seriously tried to apply it, choosing instead to act from inclination, from pressure, from the path of least resistance, and to construct the justification afterward. Kant calls this doing the right thing for the wrong reason, or the wrong thing with a clean conscience. Both are failures of the same kind. There is one more layer beneath all of this, and it is the one that most people find unbearable, because it is not about what you do. It is about why you do it, and what it reveals about whether you are actually capable of what Kant considered the only unconditionally good thing in the world. Here is a question you probably have not asked yourself honestly. How many of the right things you have done were actually right? And how many were right for you at that particular moment, in that particular situation, where being right also happened to be convenient? Kant opens the groundwork with a claim that sounds simple and lands like a stone. The only thing that is unconditionally good is a good will, not intelligence, not talent, not good intentions paired with good outcomes, not virtue that happens to align with what you wanted anyway, a will that acts from duty, from the recognition of what the moral law demands, regardless of what it costs, regardless of what you feel, regardless of whether anyone is watching or whether the outcome rewards you for it. This is the part of Kant that people most want to soften. Schiller famously mocked it. If you help your friend with warmth and genuine affection, does that mean your action has no moral worth? The misreading is understandable. But Kant is not saying that feeling and duty cannot coexist. He is saying that feeling cannot be the ground of the moral worth of an action. What makes an action moral is not that it felt right, or that it produced good results, or that it aligned with your values in a comfortable way. What makes it moral is that it was done because it was the right thing to do. Full stop. The distinction matters because of what it reveals about most human behavior. Most people do the right thing when it is also the easy thing, the socially rewarded thing, the thing that costs them nothing significant. They are honest when honesty is low risk. They are generous when generosity is visible. They follow their principles when their principles happen to align with their interests. None of this is evil, but Kant would say it tells you very little about your character. Because the real test of a will is not what it does when virtue and inclination point in the same direction. The test is what it does when they diverge. When telling the truth means losing something. When doing the right thing means standing alone. When the morally correct choice produces consequences that fall entirely on you, with no compensation, no recognition, no guarantee that it will matter. That is where Kant locates the real question about who you are. Not in your best moments, when everything aligned, in the moments where duty and desire pointed in opposite directions, and you had to choose which one actually governed you. Most people, examined honestly, discover that their principles have a hidden condition. They hold until the cost becomes real. They believe in honesty until honesty threatens their comfort. They believe in fairness until fairness disadvantages them. They believe in doing the right thing until the right thing requires them to give something up. At that point, the reasoning shifts. Suddenly, the situation is more complicated than it seemed. Suddenly, there are factors to weigh, consequences to consider, exceptions to acknowledge. What is actually happening is that inclination is overriding duty, and reason is being recruited after the fact to justify the choice that was already made. Kant calls this heteronomy. The will governed not by the moral law it gives itself, but by external forces, desire, social pressure, fear of loss, hunger for approval, dressed up in the language of moral reasoning. It is seductive precisely because it feels like thinking. You are producing arguments. You are considering consequences. You are arriving at conclusions. But the conclusion was fixed before the reasoning began, and the reasoning exists to protect it. The alternative is not the suppression of feeling. It is the cultivation of what Kant calls a good will. A will that has trained itself to recognize the difference between what it wants to do and what it is obligated to do, and that chooses obligation, not reluctantly, not resentfully, but with the clarity of someone who understands what is actually at stake, not comfort, not outcome, the integrity of being the kind of being who can be trusted to do right even when wrong would cost nothing. This is harder than it sounds because the architecture of modern life is almost entirely designed around hypothetical imperatives. Do this to get that. Behave this way to be seen a certain way. Optimize for outcomes. The categorical demand, do this because it is what you owe to yourself and to other rational beings, independent of any return, sits outside that architecture entirely. It asks something the system around you was not built to ask. And underneath the discomfort of acting from duty lies something Kant considered the deepest truth about what you are. Not a subject who obeys laws handed down from above. Something far more demanding and far more dignified than that. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a version of freedom that most people actually want. It is the freedom to do what they feel like doing without consequence. The freedom to follow desire without friction. The freedom to be unaccountable, to move through the world without the weight of having to justify anything to anyone, including themselves. This version of freedom is not what Kant means by the word, and the distance between the two is where most people get lost. Kant's concept of autonomy is not permission, it is self-legislation. The autonomous will is not one that follows its impulses freely. It is one that gives itself the law through reason, and then obeys that law because it recognizes it as its own. The opposite of autonomy is not constraint. It is heteronomy, being governed by something outside the rational self, appetite, habit, social pressure, the commands of others. Heteronomy can feel like freedom, doing whatever you want, whenever you want, guided by nothing more demanding than your own desire. But Kant sees it clearly for what it is, a will that belongs to its impulses, not to itself. This reframing is quietly devastating, because most of what people call freedom is, in Kant's terms, a sophisticated form of captivity. You are free to follow your appetites, which means your appetites are governing you. You are free from external rules, which means you are ruled entirely by whatever internal forces happen to be loudest at a given moment. The person who has never examined what they actually value, who acts from habit and reaction, and the path of least resistance, is not free in any meaningful sense. They are simply ungoverned, and ungoverned is not the same as autonomous. Genuine autonomy, for Kant, is the most demanding thing a human being can practice. It requires that you step back from every impulse, every inclination, every inherited assumption, and ask, is this something I can rationally endorse as a principle, not just for myself, but for any rational being in my position? It requires that you give yourself a law and hold yourself to it, without the enforcement of external authority, without the reward of social approval, without the guarantee of good outcomes. It requires, in short, that you become the kind of person whose behavior does not depend on being watched. Most people cannot do this consistently, not because they are weak, but because the demand is genuinely enormous. It is far easier to obey rules imposed from outside and then feel resentful of them, than to construct the rules yourself from reason and bear the full weight of having chosen them. External authority distributes the burden. Autonomy concentrates it entirely in you. Every moral failure becomes unambiguously yours. Every abdication is a choice you made with your eyes open. There is nowhere to point except inward. And yet this is also, for Kant, the source of human dignity. Not dignity in the sentimental sense, not the feeling of being valued or respected by others. Dignity in the precise sense, the property of having a worth that admits of no equivalent, that cannot be traded or calculated or replaced. He distinguishes sharply between what has a price and what has dignity. Everything with a price can be substituted. A better offer makes it negotiable. Dignity cannot be substituted because it is not a measure of usefulness or desirability. It is the mark of a being who is an end in itself. You have dignity not because of what you produce, not because of how you are regarded, not because of what you have achieved. You have it because you are a rational being capable of giving yourself the moral law. That capacity, and not anything contingent about your circumstances or your success, is what places you, in Kant's framework, beyond price. It is also what makes your failures specifically moral failures, rather than mere malfunctions. A machine cannot betray its nature. You can. And the fact that you can is precisely what makes you human. The kingdom of ends is Kant's name for the world that would exist if every rational being acted from this understanding. A community of beings who treat each other never merely as means, who legislate morally for themselves and hold themselves to what they legislate, who recognize in every other person the same capacity for rational self-governance that they claim for themselves. It is, Kant acknowledged, an ideal. It does not exist. But it is not merely a fantasy. It is a standard. It tells you what you are orienting toward every time you make a moral choice, whether you know it or not. What most people are actually oriented toward is something much smaller. Not the kingdom of ends, but the management of impressions. Not self-legislation, but the careful calibration of behavior to context. Doing enough to avoid criticism, enough to maintain relationships, enough to sleep at night.